This is my presentation of Coercion and its Fallout, chapters 12 and chapters 13. Let's get started. Coercion and the conscience. We start off with the question of should I or shouldn't I? As in, should I do something that might be bad or should I not? And so how do we negotiate these conflicting tendencies? The conflict between right and wrong can be very powerful indeed, and as we get older, we may eventually start to develop our own sense of consciousness or conscience. We may develop our own sense of what is right and wrong, our own moralities, and how to deal with those temptations. But it can take a while as we develop and get older, and I think experience life and kind of gain wisdom. Infinites, however, as Simmons says, are rather self-regarding, and I would like to throw in that so are puppies. I just got a puppy a few months ago, and he is also very self-regarding. So where does the origins of conscience come from? Simmons believes that the origins of conscience stem from coercive control, as in we try to avoid something that has been designated as bad from a past experience, and then we'll label that as, that's my conscience speaking. Freud, before him, labeled the conscience as superego, and he used that as a way to explain the internal rebellion that we might have against the morality that society kind of dictates on us. So when we look at that, conscience then becomes a social construct. It's not something that we feel or is innate or something that was developed from within, and within it's from external contingencies that came from. And when we have good things that we do, we say, oh, I gave that money back. Then we give our conscience all the credit for that. But when I take that money and you stick it in your pocket that you just found, the conscience let me down. So the origins of conscience. So Sidman takes us into the laboratory and shows us an experiment with a lab rat where he responds to the shocks with a hesitation when he pulls the lever. So the rat starts off pulling the lever and is happy, but then we start associating shocks and there's a hesitation there. And he likens that as a way the children are develop their conscience. So then they reach for the stove, we say, no, don't do that. But they're just exploring the world, and they're trying to find out what's good or bad. In their life, everything's been good. Food's been good, changing diapers, good. Why wouldn't this wonderfully cool metal object be cool to touch? And so they get reprimanded by their parent because of the danger of what they're about to do. And then the child will eventually make their own warnings. First, verbally, they'll say, oh, this is bad, I shouldn't touch it, it's hot. Obviously simpler language than that. And then silently to themselves. And then after a while, that silence really they just look at as the voice in their head. The Jiminy Cricket, that's their conscience. And that's the advantage that we have of using speech that a rat does not have. And we can take these simple words that we use, this is bad, touching a stove bad, and we eventually evolve it into this is illegal or this is immoral. Conscience and control. So we can't always watch someone's every action, so we rely on the developed conscience. I can definitely speak as a parent. I think about that, where I feel like I'm teaching my kids to be able to go out in the world and make good decisions. So if that's how you want to call it, developing a conscience, then I guess so. And so we begin to set limits on a child's behaviors, punishing them when they go too far with something. They run out in the street and they might get yelled at because you're afraid they might get hurt. As we grow into teenagers, we rely more on the community to keep a watchful eye. And so people, as they grow up, will start to press the levers to see where they get punished and where they don't. And then some of these actions they can kind of deem as, well, that's a safe action. But if they continue to be tempted by some of these, the community may regard them as dangerous. They might have like strange behaviors or taboo, things they do that are taboo, even if they're not actually breaking any laws. So is the conscience to be trusted? I think we all depend on individual conscience to remain civilized. And some examples I was thinking of is like driving. Like when you're driving, you're depending on everyone else to follow the rules, and and say I don't want to careen into you just because. Or in politics, people with power, you're depending on them to do the right thing, and even though a lot of times they do not. Or it's social events, like if you're at a concert, you depend on everybody to remain calm and to have a good time there, and not break out into a fight. So you are depending on everybody's conscience around you all the time. And organized religion also is used to maintain a moral compass for everyone, to kind of keep everyone's conscience. Don't do this or else. Where do the failures of conscience come from? Sidman says, they stem from our reliance on coercion to counter bad behaviors. But sometimes the positives of doing something bad can be stronger than the conscience that was built to stop that through their history. So the inner guide can easily be manipulated. Conscience and control. Criminals of all types can readily be positively reinforced while avoiding punishment, such as the mob using threatening tactics to hush people, or political and financial leaders using their power to influence laws or markets for their own gain, or the wealthy individuals. They can do large penalties. Someone puts a large penalty on them. If you're a billionaire, $1 million penalty is not going to do much for you. So morality is then exploited by the upper class to keep lower class people in line. And conscience is beginning to fail society over the globe. Third world countries, terrorism, and Sidman ends this chapter saying we need a replacement for the conscience. So my first question, Sidman paints a pretty dismal picture of our society and its future in our current state. And this book was written in 1989. So do you feel that he was right about the direction the world has taken in the last 32 years? And do you agree that we can lay the blame on our affinity for coercive control? Do you think that's where this all comes from? I'll write this down so that you can refer back to it in the post. Next up, between a rock and a hard place. Coercion. What coercion? So most of us become so accustomed to coercion that we don't realize when it's being done to us or when we are doing it to others. If we find success with our punishments, we tend to do it again in all circumstances. Being a teacher, I do see that a lot, where some teachers go, well, this has always worked for me, and they kind of apply this way of working with student behaviors to everyone. It doesn't always work out. So there's two types of responses to coercion. You either are going to work harder or you're going to leave. I've been in that experience where I have been the one that was being coercively controlled, and I worked harder, and then I took that experience and I applied it to other students. This was a long time ago in a different world. And I now realize that I was basically teaching how I was taught, and that didn't necessarily work for everybody that I was teaching at the time. Anyway, moving on. Some may misinterpret this as a freedom of choice, and sometimes we have no choice and cannot avoid the coercion, so what happens then? I liken this to kind of schools reopening and how I'm feeling right now about having to go back and the anxiety I'm feeling there. So this becomes what's called conditioned suppression. So how do we respond when we're faced with an impending shock? We could try to use the time between the signal for the shock and the actual shock itself to be productive, but we usually the most unproductive during this time. It's usually when we face anxiety, when we stop doing everything because we're so anxious about what's about to happen. And then afterwards, we go back to normal. Behavioral analysts have labeled this as conditioned suppression, and we also know it as anxiety. I would say be careful, though, of using this mentalism, where you kind of use anxiety as an answer to why they're doing something. So even though the effects of conditioned suppression or anxiety can be lessened through drugs or surgery, I wasn't really sure what he meant by that, but you may still see similar patterns of behavior, so that doesn't necessarily fix anything. And causes of condition suppression, you get, there's three things that we want to be aware of. You get a warning signal, an unavoidable shock of some sort, and a baseline activity that is positively reinforced. So outside the laboratory, where can we find examples of condition suppression outside the laboratory? You can find it facing your own or someone else's mortality, if you have somebody close to you that's about to die. Natural disaster, we may go into hiding when we know that a hurricane's going to come, be frozen in fear. Problems at work, if your boss wants to speak to you. Soldier in War, which made me think of the book Red Badge of Courage. That whole book is about, the feelings of, what if you're scared at the moment of truth. Financial uncertainty, people, how they were feeling when the Great Depression hit. And we can also see examples of condition suppression in everyday lives, like waiting to be scolded by your parents, like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen when dad gets home? People may become condition suppressors, like the police or your boss or teachers. And I kind of liken this to being a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you get pulled over by a cop and you get nervous by the cop, who then has to do something because you're acting strange that makes you more nervous, and then it's just the whole thing spirals out. He went into some stuff about organ transplants, moving loved one to another home. I wasn't sure what he meant by that. It kind of seemed like he went on a tangent. And then he also talked about prisons and using indiscriminate punishment, and how that can also be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the economics of anxiety. Sometimes condition suppression can lead to a positive outcome. We see that in nature, benefits of surrendering. It can also be seen in soldiers who get PTSD, and because of that, they avoid combat. Although eventually psychiatrists figured out that that actually wasn't really helping them, because then they had new problems of feeling like they abandoned their friends and their duty to their country. So there have been some treatments discovered in the laboratory, like electroconvulsive therapy, which is only a temporary solution, or some tranquilizing drugs that have proven to be effective. And someone who normally gets positive reinforcers generally is unproductive during a signal or shock. And someone who is conditioned through coercion will generally do the opposite. So anxiety could be labeled as either kind of depression or hyperactivity, depending on who you are. And we can experience this, I experience this through like cleaning the house when I'm anxious. Sometimes when I get really anxious about something, I will actually be more active instead of less active. The differences between condition suppression and other environmental contingencies could explain the difference in the success or failure of like therapeutic procedures on different people. So an experiment done on a lab rat where the signals were varied, the rat became less productive. If the signals were infrequent, the rat became more productive if the signals were more frequent. Well, why is that? Well, the lab rat was only as anxious as he needed to be. So they figured out that he was actually getting enough food. He didn't have to work in between the anxious moments of the signal. So that kind of says, well, maybe crippling anxiety is something that's for the rich. However, he ends the chapter saying we shouldn't judge anyone because we don't know how they're feeling and what they could be experiencing. So can you think of a time in your own life where you experienced anxiety or condition suppression, where you could not function for a period of time until the moment it had passed? I'm also going to write that down in the post. All right, thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion. Bye.